Hello, this is Robbie Mitchell here from Head in the Cloud Development. Today I'm going to walk you through an example of how to use NetSuite's Dataset Builder and Workbook Builder plugins to create a budget versus actual report entirely in SuiteScript. Before we get into it, I'm going to give you a little preview right now so you can decide if you want to keep watching or not. So here in NetSuite, right on my home dashboard, I have a portlet that shows you an analytics workbook. This workbook is a rendition of a very simple budget versus actuals report. Now you might ask why we would want to do this, when everybody knows that the budget versus actual report is one of the fundamental reports that NetSuite comes with out of the box. I have two reasons for doing it as a scripted workbook today. First, what if you want someone who just has Employee Center access to be able to see your budget versus actuals report? We're going to solve this dilemma by displaying this workbook in a Suitelet in the Employee Center. Second, the budget versus actual report is a really good example that everyone is familiar with of when you would actually need to link together two totally separate data sets. So before we look at the code, let me show you what the workbook looks like here in the UI. If I go into my analytics, I'm going to click on this budget versus actual workbook, and we can see here that I've linked together two data sets. One is the budgets data set and another is an actual expenses data set. If we analyze the link, we can see that they're linked together by posting period and by department. I'll quickly show you what each of these datasets looks like individually. This is the budgets dataset. It's worth mentioning that in saved searches, you can't get this level of detailed data from budgets, which is why we have to do it here in analytics. And to show you the expenses dataset, this is just my very simple expenses data set that just shows vendor bills. So if you want to see how we create this analytics workbook in SuiteScript, keep on watching. And before we get into it, I want to mention that most of what we're going through is actually covered in various sections of the NetSuite help. Let me show you where to find this. In the help menu, if we go to Suite Analytics, Workbook, Custom Workbooks and Datasets, Dataset Linking in Suite Analytics Workbook. Here there's a video that walks through creating basically this workbook in the user interface. And I recommend you watch this video later, especially if you want to take the budget versus actual workbook further than what I do in my video here. Now all this being said, believe it or not, it took me quite a long time and a lot of effort to figure out how to do all this stuff in SuiteScript. The help sections are a bit disjointed and difficult to follow, and they don't all agree with each other. So throughout this tutorial, I'll do my best to reference the help sections as we go through the code. I'll also mention that doing all this in SuiteScript is relatively new in NetSuite, and there are a couple of bugs that we're going to run into and discuss workarounds for. So now just to give you a quick visual overview again. In script, we're going to create both data sets, the workbook and a Suitelet. The goals of the video are that you should come out of here with a basic understanding of how the Dataset Builder plugin works, also the Workbook Builder plugin, and how to load and output the data from a workbook pivot table in SuiteScript. So what do you need to know to get started? This video is intended for NetSuite administrators and developers. You should have the administrator role in NetSuite to do everything I cover here. You should have either WebStorm or VS Code set up with the SuiteCloud SDF plugin. If you don't have that set up yet, check the NetSuite help or watch my other videos and do that first. And after we go through this, I'm going to publish the code for all this on GitHub so that you can download it and use it directly from there. So check the comments on the video. Okay, so let's get ready to get started. Let me first answer another question here. Why would you go about creating datasets and workbooks in code when it's obviously so much easier to create them in the UI? 3 reasons. First, at least right now, there is a bug in the SuiteScript API where, at least in my experience, it will never let me load a workbook that has been created in the UI in a script. In other words, I can't write out the data from this workbook in SuiteScript. I get an unexpected error. Whereas if we create it in code, it loads just fine. Secondly, maybe you want to publish datasets and workbooks as part of an account customization project or a Suite app. It's good to know how to use these plugin types. Finally, creating these objects in code will help you understand some of the intricacies of analytics in NetSuite much better. There are quite a few levels of data involved here, and doing it in code forces you to put together the pieces in more detail. Okay, so first things first, let's initialize an SDF account customization project for this. So in my WebStorm new project menu, I'm going to choose account customization. I'm going to call it HITC budget versus actual. Click create. Now, of course, we're going to do this in TypeScript. So let's set up our package.json and tsconfig.json files. For package.json, we just have one dev dependency. It's the @hitc NetSuite types module. I'll go ahead and run npm install. I'm going to add my tsconfig. tsconfig, I'm going to copy and paste some data in. You can use this from the downloaded files as well. This basically says that when we compile TypeScripts, we're going to put them in the src file cabinet SuiteScripts folder. Now, the first thing we want to create is the dataset for our budgets. So if you right-click on the Objects folder here and go to New Custom Object, here you'll see a list of all the objects the SDF plugin supports. Except as of right now, neither the dataset builder or workbook builder script types are available yet. So we're going to have to do this in a slightly backwards approach. So let's first create our script file. So in our src folder, let's right-click and make a new directory for TypeScripts. As we can see, this is what our tsconfig file is looking for here. And now let's right-click on that folder and create a HITC budget dataset. So let's set up our header comment block. So our main entry point function here is create dataset. Now I like to tell WebStorm not to warn me about unused global functions, so I'm going to do that here. Okay, now before we go any farther, let's reference the NetSuite help quickly. If we look in the SuiteScript section, in the workbook module reference, there's an example script here. If we scroll down, this example script is really similar to what we're trying to do here. It shows how to create a budgets dataset. We can see this here. Alternatively, you could open up the budget data set that we have in the UI and export it to SDF and read the XML. But don't get your hopes up too much about that. The XML definition and outputs is not directly usable to us, but we can use it to analyze some of the information we see to understand, for example, how to create this FY 2022 filter. Let me show you what I mean. If we open the data set and export it to XML, we might, for example, want to see how to create this year's FY 2022 filter here. And if we look at the XML, we can see here that for that we'd need to create this filter with the key value 358 for FY 2022. So the XML is a bit helpful, but for our example, in the spirit of doing things iteratively, let's just get the most basic example up and running first. We're going to need two modules for this, so we'll import the query module and the dataset module. So to create our dataset here, we can say context.dataset equals dataset.create. Type is budgets, and we'll give it a name. I'll comment out the query module because we're not quite ready to use it yet. But let's try uploading this and just implementing it as is. To compile it, we just need to run the tsc command in the terminal here. And if you don't have TypeScript installed yet and you get an error, you may need to run this command first. npm install -g TypeScript. That'll install TypeScript globally, and then you can run tsc again and compile it. And after you compile, you should see a JavaScript file under your SuiteScript folder. Now let's get ready to deploy our project for the first time. The first time you do, you'll probably need to set up your account under NetSuite and Account Management. And then under Project Settings, you'll want to select it as your default account. So I've got mine selected. I'm going to click OK. So I'm deploying my project, and it's deployed successfully. So now back in NetSuite, let's go to Customizations, Plugins, Plugin Implementations, New. Select my file here and click Create Plugin Implementation. I'm just going to name mine HITC Budget Dataset. Give it an ID, HITC Budget Dataset. I'm going to set my status to released. We'll give it a short description as well, as I find it makes it stand out more when looking at it in the list of datasets. And I'll click Save. And now let's download this to XML so we can get it into our project. I'm just going to drag and drop that from my downloads into my objects folder. So here's the XML of what we just created. But now back in NetSuite, let's take a look at our data set and see how it looks. So I'll go to Datasets, filter it to My Datasets, and if I try to view this dataset, I get an error saying please enter at least one column to continue. Okay, that makes sense. So let's go back to our code and build out this data set just a bit more. So we need to add some columns. The columns we want to have in our data set are account, period, amount, and department. The simplest of these are account and department, so let's add these first. And while we're adding these, I'm going to give them an alias, as this is how we'll reference them in the workbook builder script later on. Okay, so let's build and upload this. And since I'm just uploading one file, I can click on the JavaScript and do upload file to account. Okay, so then back in NetSuite, I'm just going to click refresh. And there we go. So here's our account and department values. So it works, but it's not very useful yet. Let's go back and add in the period and amount columns as well. And again, I'll mention that this bit is covered in the help section. From this, we can see that we need to join in the period and the amount from the budget machine, which just means the line level budget data. So let's go ahead and define our budget lines join and our two columns. Okay, let's again upload and check it out in the UI. I'll refresh my workbook here. Okay, yeah, it's coming along. So what we're going to do next is add in a filter so that we only see the 2022 budget data, because I don't really care about anything before that here. But wait, how in the world do we add in a filter like that in code? Well, to find out, let's examine the XML of the budget data set that we created in the UI, as I've exported it to XML. So when we look at the criteria tag here, this is where we can look at this date filter. This shows that the period value for FY 2022 is the ID 358. So let's look at how to add this to our code as a condition now. The create condition method is where we need to use the query module to join in the operators. So the way we create our condition is like this. We create a column representing the year. The operator is query.operator.anyOf, and the value is the ID 358, which we know is 2022. It's values. Okay, so now let's upload this and test again. So refreshing my data set. All right, now this is much more of what we want. This is just 2022. So now we're finished with our budgets data set. Let's do a save as from this data set to create our actuals data set. First we'll do the save as from the XML file. And we'll change the script name. OK. And we'll do a save as from the TypeScript as well. Now this one is going to be slightly more complicated than the other one. First, let's clear out everything we have here. And I'll change the type from budgets to transaction. Let's start by downloading the data set that we made in the UI so that we can analyze the XML. But before we get into this, let's add a couple of the easy columns. So looking at this data set, we can start by adding a couple of the simple columns like entity and transaction display. Tran display name. And let's go ahead and compile this and deploy this. I'll have to comment out query because we're not using it quite yet. Now it looks like I have an S here, but I didn't have an S here, so let's just add that in. I'll try deploying it again. Okay, that time it worked. So now let's go back and look at what we have so far. Go to my data sets. Here's my actuals data set. So yeah, right now it's an unfiltered list of transactions and entities. So far so good. So now let's work on our filters. So back in the UI version we created, we have 3 filters: type, date, and line item. Again, we can find what these look like in the XML here in the criteria section. So let's add them into ours. We'll do the transaction type column first. Now when we create a condition, as we saw in the budgets data set, first thing we need to have is a column. So first, I'm going to define a type column here that can be used in my filter and the columns. And then I'll create my type condition. The operator is any of. Now this is where we need the query module. And the values, as we can see in the XML, is vendBill. And let's do something similar for the date filter. So first I'll create a date column. And now if you haven't seen how date filters work yet in analytics, brace yourself because it isn't pretty. There's some interesting formatting here to define the date ranges. So again, we're trying to say that we want the date to be within this year. So we're going to use the within operator from query module. But for the values, we have to give it a start and end. And we use date IDs in analytics. So for this year, it's TY. Now again, you'll see these in the XML if you're wondering where I got it from. Got the date ID here, start and end. So now let's put these conditions together in our data set using the AND operator. And we'll specify children here. Finally, let's do the item condition, which requires a join on transaction lines. Here I'll make my item condition. To say none of none, we say any of not, and value is null. And we'll add this into our main condition. And let's make sure to add in our date, type, and item columns in the columns here. And now let's build and upload. Again, we can just upload this single JavaScript file. And we'll refresh what we've got here. Okay, so our filters work and our data is coming along. We need to add in a few more columns here for department, period, and amount, because that's what our budget versus actuals report will actually rely on. For department, we'll join this in from the lines and give it an alias. The period does not have a join, but we do need to give it an alias. And finally, for the amount, referencing the XML, we're going to do an absolute value on the transaction line for an amount. And note here that its data type is float. I'll show you how to add this here. Okay, that should be it. So let's build and upload this again. Okay, great. So now both our data sets are done, and now we can move on to creating the workbook. So first, for the XML, let's again do a save as. So I know the character limit on these script names is 40 characters, and I can see this is 36, so that's okay. Now let's make sure to change the main tag here from dataset builder plugin to workbook builder plugin. Now let's create our new TypeScript file. And we'll do our header comment. And here the script entry point is the create workbook function. Now, to know what we're doing, let's again look at our example in the NetSuite help on the workbook module. Here, after we create our datasets, we then come down and start creating the workbook. Here's where we create the workbook. So kind of working backwards, we're going to create a pivot, create some data measures. But where we start with is by linking the data sets. So that's what we're going to do first here. So let's do the same thing on our end. So we're going to need 3 modules here. We're going to need the dataset link, and workbook modules. So first we need to load our data sets. Now remember, we're going to link them together using the department and the period. So let me show you how to do that. We basically need to extract both of those values from both of the data sets by the alias. Now we can link our data set. The links are an array of arrays, linking the budget department to the expense department, and the budget period to the expense period. Finally, we need to give it an ID. Let's try that. So then if we continue along in the help, we can see that next they're setting up a pivot table with the accounting periods as rows and the budget and actual amount as columns. So let's do the same thing on our end. So this period dimension is how the rows of the workbook work. Here we're extracting the amount from the budget data set. So here we've set up the budget column. And again, I'm just following along with what they're doing in the example here. Now we'll set up the actual amount column. Sorry, this should be actual amount. And finally, we'll put the columns together into a column section. And finally, we'll create the pivot table. Specify our dataset link here. The row axis we'll create using our period section. And finally, to output it, context.workbook equals workbook.create name and pivots. Pivot. Okay, let's build and deploy this and see how it looks so far. In my Analytics tab, I'll go to Workbooks, and it's this first one here, HITC Budget versus Actuals Workbook. Okay, it looks great so far. The only thing we have left is to add the variance column, and this is the tricky part. To do this, we're going to reference two things. First, again, let's download the XML from our working UI version here. Second, I'm going to show you another page in the NetSuite help. Again, going to the workbook module definition. But now let's look at the page on calculated measures. Now there's a very helpful code sample here. This is showing a balance that's the difference between two measure values, which is exactly what the variance is in a budget versus actual amount. Let me show you what I mean. In our UI example, if we look at the variance value here, I can see that it's one amount minus another, and if I mouse over them, we can see the first one is the budget amount, and the second one is the formula from our actuals dataset. Now let's try doing this in our code before we look at the XML that we downloaded. Again, this is what we're trying to do. We're going to create a calculated measure that basically has an expression made from two other expressions within it. So first we're going to define our budget measure expression, then our expenses measure expression, and then we'll put them together in a subtraction expression. And then finally we'll create the calculated measure. So these are our two inner expressions. Now let's put them together in a subtraction expression. And finally, let's create our calculated measure from this expression. And now that we have this measure set up, let's add it to our columns. Okay. We have a bit of a problem. WebStorm says this isn't valid. So let's check the help documentation on this create section method and see what it says. Okay, this says that creating a section you can use as children, data dimensions, measures, or another section. Using a calculated measure is not one of the options. Using a regular measure is, but if I try calling the create measure method, I get an error saying this method doesn't exist yet. So what do? Well, we know we have a working example of this in the UI, right? So let's start by examining this XML a little closer. First, let's replace these ampersand LT symbols with a less than sign. to make it more usable. Okay, and now let's copy and paste this first really long XML line into an XML beautifier. And if we look through this, it should look really similar to what we've set up in our script. So let's scroll down and find our calculated measure. Here it is. So this calculated measure is based on an expression that's a minus with two measure value expressions inside it. One being the sum from the formula, and the other being the sum of the budget amount. To me, this looks like an exact match to what we have in our code, which tells me that maybe our code is correct and NetSuite's documentation is out of date. Well, to get past this error in the code, all we have to do is say as any here at the end of line 35. Now let's compile this and see what happens. When I refresh the page, our workbook loads, but then we get an unexpected error on the actual pivot table. But look here, our variance column is here, so let's inspect it. This looks exactly like what we saw in the working UI version, right? Well, what happens if I just click the apply button here? Okay, we need to refresh to see the changes. But look, it magically works after I adjust it in the UI. So this must be some sort of bug in NetSuite, and I suspect they'll address it soon. But guess what? This won't stop us. Our workbook is not our final output here, after all. We're here to create a Suitelet that renders this workbook. So let's try that and see how it goes. To create our Suitelet, let's right-click on the Objects folder and say New Custom Object. Object type is Script Suitelet. Call it HITC budget v actual SL. The default function is onRequest. For the name, we'll say HITC budget versus actual Suitelet. The script file is going to be SuiteScripts HITC budget versus actual Suitelet.js. Set the deployment ID to custom deploy 1. Set the title to HITC budget versus actual. Now let's create our TypeScript file for it. We'll set up our header comment. Our entry point is the onRequest method. Now before we do anything fancy, let's just create a simple form and deploy this. To make a form, we need the server widget module. We'll deploy this. And when I first try to deploy this, I get an error saying that the server-side scripting feature must be required. And that makes sense. To resolve that, we just right-click on the project and say, add dependency references to manifest. And when we do, it'll add this feature to our manifest file automatically. So now we can try deploying it again. Okay, so that time it worked. Let's find our new Suitelet in NetSuite. Here it is. Okay, that looks fine. So far, so good. Now back to the code. So our goal here is to create a simple HTML table that displays our workbook pivot table. Let's start by adding an HTML table without worrying about the workbook yet. We do know the columns in the table are going to be period, budget, actual expenses, and variance. So I can go ahead and add those here. So here's where we're going to add all our data, and then after that we'll close the table. Finally here we'll add a field to show the HTML. And let's build and upload this to check it out. Okay, that's something. Now let's load the workbook and actually get some data in here. So we load it by referencing the custom script name that we've set up for it here. And once we've loaded the workbook, we need to then run our pivot table like this. I can't remember what my pivot ID is, so let's look at that. Now, traversing the data in this pivot table is a little tricky. Let's take a look again at the sample code on the workbook module. The sample code here in the N workbook module help has an example to get you started, but from here you might have to experiment a bit in the script debugger. Thankfully, I've already done that work for you here, so I can tell you what you need to do. So as in the example here, the first thing we're going to do is get the row reference to see if it has item values. If it doesn't, that means it's the header row and we can skip it. So if there's no row.item values, continue to the next row. Now, I don't know about you, but I like to be able to see what kind of data I'm working with. So first, why don't we just add a log here so we can see what an intersection even looks like. Let's run this. And I do, we should get some logs here. Okay, so there's quite a bit of data here. Basically, each intersection represents a pivot table row. And if we look closely, we can see that it has everything we need, the period and the values. So with this, if the data you're working with is a little bit different than mine, you can figure out how to extract it. But for our scenario, the first value we need is the name of the period or the month. Let's see if we can extract at least that and write out our HTML row for each intersection. Here's how we'll read our period name. I'll just put placeholders in for the budget. The actual amount. And variance. And let's build and upload this. Okay, so with this we can see that we are indeed reading each intersection row. That's a great start, but now let's go back and do the rest. So one thing we saw is that our data has an attribute called measure values. And it contains the budget, actual, and variance amounts. But the odd thing is, they aren't always in the same sequence. So as we iterate through these measures, we need to check the label to see which value it is. So first let's initiate all the values for this row to 0. And let's go ahead and plug these into our HTML. And when we're reading these, depending on which type of value it is, we need to extract the data slightly differently. So if measure value dot measure dot label is budget, then our month budget, then this is how we read the budget. Otherwise, if our measure value dot measure dot label is expenses, then this is how we read it. If it's not either of those, then we know it's the variance, in which case this is how we read it. Clear as mud? Yeah, I thought so. So let's upload this. Okay, great. So we have all our values, but it's not very pretty. Let's add just a little bit of styling to make this much more appealing to the eyes. Here we'll add a styling block, and our table ID is budget versus actual. Let's add a border on the table itself and collapse it. We'll make the header cells bold. We'll add some padding and a border to the cells themselves. And then let's add a number class to right align the numerical values. And we'll set that here on these 3 cells. Okay, let's try this and see if it looks better. Nope, because I forgot an opening quote here. Let's try again. There we go. It's amazing what a big difference a single character can make. That's much better. So now to publish this to the Employee Center, let's go back and adjust the Suitelet XML a bit. What we need to do on the deployment is set all roles to T to deploy it to all roles. We'll set the status to released, and we'll add a link to the Employee Center. Okay, so let's deploy this. And then if I switch to the Employee Center role, here it is. It should show up on the left under Custom. But look, I get an error saying unable to load workbook. I think maybe we need to set the Suitelet to run as role administrator. Let's try administrator in all caps. There we go. That helps. Our Employee Center role now has access to the budget versus actuals report. And that's all for now. I hope you've enjoyed this intro to analytics scripting. Feel free to get in touch if you have any questions. Otherwise, we'll see you at SuiteWorld. Thanks for watching.